here he is. This is after the entrance into the city, and it's also before his suffering comes along. It's in that week. It's in an in-between place. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." And Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, which is just a few hundred yards away across the little Kidron Valley, when he's there, he's on top of the Mount of Olives, and they're looking upon, this is that Chamber of Commerce look that you get of Jerusalem, and the Golden Dome and all of that, and they're able to see it. He's there with Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and they ask him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of birth pangs." If we understand the chronology that's at play here of Mark's gospel, if we understand it correctly, if we look upon a calendar and toss these stories up on the calendar, what we begin to understand is that Jesus speaks these words at the end of Tuesday, 3 days before the crucifixion. This is what's happening. On Tuesday of Holy Week, he and his disciples are standing on the Temple Mount, and they're gazing together at the opulence of the temple itself. It's one of the grandest temples that have ever been built. And Jesus and those who followed him were Galileans, not the sophisticated urban crowd. They were not suburbanites. They were not from the city of Jerusalem. They were from the country. Those from the city perhaps had grown a little blasé about the temple. They were there maybe daily, certainly weekly. They were surrounded around it. But for these Galileans, this site was beyond what they could understand and imagine. Its grandeur took their breath away. And they marveled at it for good reason. It stood majestically at the top of the Mount Zion, which is what would it be? The tallest peak in the Central Highlands. It's a strategic place, both for the country and for their religion. And it sits on a tabletop plaza that towered above the old city. I've been on the Temple Mount many times. And when I'm there, I'm always wondering, how big is this? I'm not a country boy, so I don't know what an acre looks like. Okay? This is 37 acres of a plaza that elevates itself above the old city of Jerusalem. The temple courtyard walls were made of white marble, and it glistened in the bright sunshine. Massive stone columns majestically lined the perimeter of the Temple Mount. This is where people would walk and talk, and teachers would teach, and things would happen, and commerce would be held, and it was a very fascinating place, a cultural place. And they held up these porches that surrounded the Temple Mount. The temple itself straddling Mount Zion, the peak of Mount Zion was directly below the temple. So it was constructed over that top center piece. And the peak of Mount Zion is where Abraham tried to sacrifice his son Isaac. The Temple Mount, in its immensity, 37 acres, the temple was over 100 feet tall. When I walk in, when I preach this sermon or read this text and I think about where we worship, I began to think about our own dimensions. I tried to guesstimate yesterday. I'm thinking it's probably 40 feet, give or take. Somebody can go measure it if they wish. But 40 feet, and the temple being 100 feet tall. To which, when I got home last night, Wanda, my inquisitive wife, said, "Are you sure about that? 100 feet?" Well, yes, that's what it was. The walls of the temple were covered with great sheets of gold. Can you imagine how bright this must have been in the sunlight? The white marble, the gold sheeting on the walls. From a distance, the Temple Mount was a brilliant spectacle. Josephus, first century historian, wrote of a winter scene. Imagine the winter scene with snow on the ground like we've had this week. And the gold on the temple, he said, reflected so fierce a blaze of fire of those who tried to look at it were forced to turn away. It seemed in the distance like a mountain covered in snow, for any part not covered in gold was dazzling white. What a spectacle. It's not surprising that long after the temple had been destroyed, the rabbis would continue to claim, whoever has not seen the temple has never seen a beautiful building in his life. It was the week of Passover when Jesus and the disciples entered Jerusalem. It was a pivotal time to be there, a time when the city was bloated with religious pilgrims. A town that normally carried about 25,000 inhabitants would become 100 or 125,000 people. It was an amazing time for the people from the countryside to come and to travel to Jerusalem. And one can only imagine the congestion of pilgrims and priests, of beast and blood from the sacrifice, and lots of money. It must have been mind-boggling to them. And there they all stood, gaping at the blinding wonder of it all and thinking about how magnificent it was. And Jesus blurted out these stunning words. Not one stone from the structure will be left standing. Those of you who've traveled to Jerusalem, and we've got a group that's headed there in another 6 weeks or so, there's around the perimeter of the Temple Mount, which is where the western wall is, and then again on the south side, the stones that have been torn down from the temple were rolled off the top of the Temple Mount. They are enormous. One of them is 35 feet in length and about 4 feet thick and about 5 feet wide. That's one stone. We would not know how to move a rock such as that. The stones from the temple were torn down and rolled off the edge of the Temple Mount. Jesus says this, not one stone will be left here upon another. All of that happened in 70 AD. Hard to imagine? Well, certainly it is. Let's go in our imagination, though, to the mall in Washington, D.C. A bright, sunny July 4th celebration would work just fine. Hundreds of thousands of people are gathered there, patriots and celebrators and protesters and the whole gambit of American culture would be there. And one of us, seeing past all of the breathtaking grandeur of it all, begins to speak as if overtaken by blinding vision and imagining the utter desolation of everything. This week, with the damage that the fires have done in California, gives us an idea of what total destruction looks like. The absolute destruction of everything significant along the mall, and in its place a vision of rubble and smoke and destruction. Jesus could look past the visitors themselves, past the cacophony of sights and sounds, and past the blindingly beautiful opulence of the stark white temple, and all he saw were ruins. Only stones left in a heap. No rhyme or reason about how they were skewed upon the ground, on the floor. Only the remembrance of what they had helped to form when they were originally brought to this peak of land. The disciples were bowled over by what he saw and what he spoke of. It was a shocking declaration, and the absolute clarity by which he would say these things. And they naturally asked him the question that all of us would ask: when will this take place? What will be the sign that this is about to happen? Those have been the questions asked by every generation of believers that has come along in the last 2,000 years since this day. Is there a time when Jesus is coming back? Are the signs of the time warning us to be ready? And every generation of believers that's lived has struggled with these questions, and yet the answer has been over and over and over again, no, this is not the time. Jesus has some direct advice for those who fear that the end is approaching. Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am the one, I am he, and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. And certainly we have faced this in the world over and over and over again. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of birth pangs. Startling words from our Master, standing in the midst of all that he envisioned. Christian doomsayers add to the cultural hysteria with their warnings. And Jesus tells us quite simply, do not go after them. Every generation has someone who rises up every handful of years and says, I know when the end is coming. Some of them are foolish enough to attach a day to it and a time. And then from there, the cultural media takes over. And Jesus says, do not go after them. Do not be terrified when the sky is falling, we might ask. When the world is coming to an end, that's right, Jesus says. Do not go after them. Do not be terrified. Don't you hear the comforting words of Jesus given in the Gospels? When I was a student at Baylor a long time ago, 100 years ago, there were stories out of the religion department about a group that had gathered in Waco, Texas, called the Branch Davidians. They had been together since the 30s, and during the 50s, they pronounced a date in Waco. They sold all their stuff as a church, and they met up on top of Mount Carmel, which is a neighborhood in Waco. And there they were, waiting for the end to come. And nothing happened. They set a second date, and nothing happened on that date. Does the name Branch Davidians ring a bell with you? It should, because in the 90s they had reconstituted and they had reformed after the collapse back in the 50s. And they had a new leader. And they became something quite despairing. Jesus soberly warned them that the future would not be safe. This is a part of his message. He pointed to a time, he pointed over the horizon of time, to a time that was coming when the children of God would not be safe from evil in the world. Arrest and persecution were the ways the world announced their opposition to the good news of Jesus' reconciling love through Christ. Believers who followed Jesus had to be ready to pick up their cross to die with him. It was a terrible time. The first 350 years or so was absolutely horrific for the church. Suffering of all manner until Constantine was named the emperor, and then history shifted and changed. Most of us have known virtually nothing about personal experience, about persecution, but they have come. There are places in the world today where you being a Christian follower, a follower of Jesus, would put you in peril. There are places where a Christian witness is not safe. Persecution comes in nations throughout Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Recently, as many as 100,000 churches gathered on a day called the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, which means that we, in the safety and the confines of being in the United States, can focus our attention upon our sisters and brothers and churches that are essentially just like us, but in places where they live out their faith in terrible peril. And in this day of prayer, they gave focus, they gave attention to the worldwide plight of Christian believers who suffer for the gospel, just as Jesus predicted. Just because it doesn't happen here so much doesn't mean it doesn't happen with incredible violence in other places. These modern-day Christian martyrs exist, and we remember them in our prayers. Could that type of opposition to the gospel occur here in America, where we live and witness? Most likely, my guess is no, not anytime soon. But there are no looming certainties about that likelihood. Jesus' warning to be ready to be persecuted for your faith has a long and storied history of truthfulness in the world's stories. And we shouldn't grow too accustomed to these protections. These are to be valued. They are to be protected. We voted. That is a big deal. in protecting our country, the act of our citizenry, of being involved, of having our eyes open and our ears open. For the first 300 years after the ministry of Jesus, the Christian church suffered tremendously. They were hunted like animals and brought before the various magistrates and kings and challenged to renounce their views, their beliefs in Jesus. And many of them recanted under the tremendous pressure of torture. But many more clung courageously to the faith, refusing to claim any other name than Jesus, and thus joining a large group of believers who became the church's heroes by their martyrdom. Here's how it would work in the Roman Empire. If you made a claim that Jesus is Lord, a thought that we hardly even think about much, because it's such a simple, wholesome proclamation. Jesus is Lord would mean that you were saying, Caesar is not Lord. That became the basis for your persecution. Which will it be? Jesus or Caesar? The question looms for us forever and ever. A ritual occurred. Rituals are wonderful. They help us to symbolize some things. And a ritual occurred that grew up in the 2,000 years of church history, where Christians would go to one another and they would pass the peace. You understand that the passing of the peace was a significant wish for one another. It was the enduring sign of the church, and it's been celebrated throughout the history of the church, even till today. It's a sign that's shared lovingly throughout the harshest of times or the best of times, even when being a believer meant the possibility of betrayal by one's brother or sister. It was shared when just the name of Christ was enough to put you in harm's way from the evil of the world. In passing the peace, one believer comes to another and offers a hand and says, "May the peace of Christ be with you." Simple. Simple. And the other would say, "And also with you." This sermon will be acted out among us as we share the peace with one another. Would you rise and greet your neighbors with the peace of Christ?